Have mercy on me, a sinner.
Now, Corey Washington, you published that book, and you've been doing the groundwork because it's hard to self-publish and self-promote and get on out there and do the work. But I noticed you're connected to a lot of the R&B tributes, the R&B Hall of Fame, and and things of that nature. How is that? How is that working? There was a groundbreaking in Mississippi about one. Can you give us an update on what the Rhythm and Blues Hall of Fame is up to, and sort of Jimmy's orbit there?
Right. They had a groundbreaking September 30th in Marks, Mississippi, which is right outside of Clarksdale. Hallowed grounds, the Mississippi Delta, which we know originated the blues, the genesis of a lot of our popular music in America. And so, we went back to the essence, so to speak, and they're getting ready to start the phase one of the actual physical building there in Mississippi. And so, it was very, to put the shovels in the ground where it's going to be at. And as far as Jimi Hendrix, he's going to be a big part of that because he's been inducted twice as a solo artist in the year 2016 and as a member of the band of Gypsies in 2019. So I look for him to play a very prominent role. And then certainly if I have anything to say about it, he definitely will have a nice chunk of space there in that museum.
That's right. Stevie, you got anything you want to ask Corey?
Beautiful. Yeah, definitely, brother. So, what is the? I mean, I kind of have a thought of the field, but maybe you can explain it. What's the pull to try to pull Jimmy out of the Black experience? Why? To pull him away from obviously something he was involved with, he spent his time with. I mean, I know as a youngster, it was the tie-in to Jimi Hendrix in the Black community was sort of tenuous. Just from my personal experience, I'm not going to say that's what he was doing, but it just
Right.
seems that there's like this like tug of war or something.
That's how powerful a figure he was. I mean, when you think about this guy, as Rickey Vincent said, he was a genius. I mean, to can be considered the top person in an instrument as prominent as a guitar is a very powerful thing. And I mean, I guess a lot of people don't want to come to the grips that this here was a black man. He didn't even finish high school. I mean, that's how, gifted he was musically by the grace of God. And here it is, this man, he's playing he's so innovative that they don't want to give him credit for where he started, which was the Seattle district, the black neighborhoods that we grew up in. And, I grew up in the poor part of New York City, and he rose from there, with some help, but at the same time, he was almost, self-made in the sense that he was a part of a Jimi Hendrix experience, but he was the focal point. He had the two English guys, but he was always the focal point. And so when you have a guy that's so innovative of the music that a lot of the mainstream loves, they don't want to give him credit that here's a guy that pretty much pioneered most of the styles that they love and not only that, but here's a guy that he could do all of that rocking out and heavy rock stuff, but he also did the R&B, the funk, and everything else. So they want to try to downplay that type of stuff and consider it inferior, like the Curtis Knights, the Cornell Dupree's, that type of music, and they want to put this other music on a pedestal, Jimi Hendrix experience and psychedelic rock and so forth. So that's the tug of war you get a lot of times is, giving this man the respect that he deserves, not just in rock, but R&B, funk, and all other kinds of music.
Mm.
That's some heavy lifting, and got much respect for what you do and the way you do it. And like I said, you do the footwork, man. That's a beautiful thing. Let me ask you about some of the women that Jimmy lost very recently in the past year. And I think you updated me. I know that Rosalie Brooks passed away, and she was a woman, black woman that played perhaps on Jimmy's first recording, depending on what else he did with maybe Little Richard. But he did two singles with her. She claims it was 1964, and other documentation says 1965, but very early in his career. And she speaks about that time in loving detail. And she was always swimming against the current, trying to tell her story, and that always kind of that was another one of those things that kind of got me into this narrative. So wait a minute, there's actually a story here, even though the current's going the other direction. That Jimmy has no race, he has no racial narrative, he has no racial alliances and allegiances. He's just a free man, and we can just love him without having to try to love his blackness or any of that. So it was a whole different thing that Rosalie turned me on to, and we had talked, and that was a great thing. But unfortunately, we lost her, and I think you said I heard we lost Fane Pridgeon, who
Right.
deserves her own
Mm.
recognition. And I saw one real in-depth story about her, but that was it. And then a third person that you were talking about.
Betty Davis.
Oh, and Betty Davis.
Right.
And that relationship has yet to be really mined and unpacked. And some of the key players are no longer there to kind of get into it. But man, that's that's the thing. You want to speak on that?
I mean, it's just like the other stuff we were talking about. Jimmy had some very powerful black women in his life. A lot of the black women in his life get pushed to the side, marginalized, and so forth, in order to elevate the Kathy Etchinghams and these other people. But the three you just mentioned were very pivotal. Rosalie Brooks, so early on, they said they wanted to be like a duo, a male and female duo, which was not common at the time. But you can't deny that the recordings exist for us to hear, in posterity. Then you got Faye Pridgeon, who was with him very early on and nurtured him and was able to foster his love of the blues and so forth. And she was even with him when he became famous and so forth. He would always go back to these women. And then Betty Davis, like you said, there's a lot that we don't know, but what we do know, is a very pivotal point in the relationship between Miles, Jimmy, and Sly. And at the forefront was Betty Davis, was that glue. So, even though she doesn't get the credit that she deserves, we're learning a lot more about her. You can't deny the power of these women and the importance in Jimmy's life and his development as an artist.
And a human being,
Right.
man, a full human being. Um, how do you feel about the state of the catalog and the reissues and the way they're promoted? I mean, I remember when they first did the Live at the Fillmore, it was around 1999, 2000, that actually took seriously. They did a documentary and talked about Machine Gun and that album itself, and put out a double CD of more of that whole session, which was 2 nights, 4 shows. And then 20 years later they do a whole just sort of packaging of the raw tape of all 4 shows. People say a
Right.
few things are still missing, but how do you feel about how that part of Jimmy's legacy is getting treated in terms of releases?
I mean, it leaves a lot to be desired, but I think it was a horrible title, "The Songs for Groovy Children." I think that's what you were referring to.
Yeah.
I tended to swallow a lot of that stuff because we got to finally hear something that nobody was really talking about. Jimmy and Buddy and Billy's rendition of man, what's that? Steal Away. A very originally a gospel song, but my favorite version is Johnny Taylor. But you know, you got Ann Peoples. But you know, it was just a thrill just to hear Jimmy playing that R&B, you know, funky guitar against Buddy Miles's silky smooth vocals. I mean, it's just that like that one song, I was able to swallow a lot of stuff I didn't like just so I can hear that song. And I mean, when you're talking about the Band of Gypsies, you know, I can never get enough of the Band of Gypsies. So, but then the good, the bad, and the ugly, we got to look at this Maui thing. You know, the recording wasn't bad, but the documentary was horrible. So, you know, it's like you get these peaks and valleys with these releases, and everybody's still waiting for that Royal Albert Hall. We want to see the full concert, which some people did get to see, but we haven't seen it in the States yet. So we're still looking for that.
Okay. And I would think Jimmy played with and hung out with so many people that at some point you can find some photos with Jimmy and Miles, or Jimmy and Sly, or Jimmy and Bobby Womack, or Jimmy and Billy Preston, or Jimmy, you know, Jimmy and some of his uh, groundbreaking musical peers from the Black experience, because I believe he had a simpatico, a brotherhood with everyone. But these things get quietly silenced. And as a matter of fact, I'm gonna break this down. When I wrote that funk book back in 1996, there were only two sections where the editors asked me if I really wanted to do it the way I did it, which is their polite way of saying, you know, trying to work their way to editing some of it. And part one was the Jimmy section, and another was the Malcolm X stuff. But what I noticed looking at documentaries of ancient Egypt, there are people that come out of the Cairo Museum that say, I had no idea how Black these Egyptians were, but we don't see those figures. We don't see those symbols of the Black history of this. All the light-skinned figurines, those are on display in photographs and booklets and around the world. But then when you go to the source, wait a minute, there's a whole different thing. And unfortunately, as much as it's changed over the last 20 years, I think there's still that with Jimmy, that there's not a real accounting of the community that he was among and from and with. And it's really just filling out the story. It's not out of some type of you know, malicious thing to try to do. It's just like, we'll tell the whole story. His last night was with War, with Eric Burden and War. And those guys talk about it all the time.
Right.
Where's the shot of them playing together, you know, in a prominent way? I know the bootleg is pretty grainy, but, you know, they could sort of recover some of this.
Yeah.
And tell a complete
Years, they
story.
didn't want to tell us that he played with Stevie Wonder at the BBC.
Yeah,
You
that
know?
was another one. That could have been in West Coast Seattle Boy if they're gonna do 4 CDs of Jimmy's kind of soul sides.
Right.
But
Summer of Love. You remember the Questlove documentary that got rave reviews, right?
mhm.
How could you do a Summer of Love documentary and not mention Jimi Hendrix? I mean, this took place in August, right after Woodstock, right?
Mhm.
About less than a month later, Jimi Hendrix was giving a free concert in Harlem. And how could you not mention that within this documentary? That seems like negligent,
Mm.
almost like it was intentional. It had to be, because here it is. This guy, you're calling this a Black Woodstock. All right, Jimi Hendrix was Woodstock as far as I'm concerned. I mean, so you calling it a Black Woodstock? You're not mentioning Jimmy. A couple weeks later, Jimmy would headline the concert for the United Block Association in Harlem, and you can't even mention that within this documentary. It makes no sense to me.
Yeah, somebody's got to do the heavy lifting, Corey Washington, and you're doing it, man. And so I got much respect for you and all your work. Now, how's the book doing? Are you getting people to notice it and getting feedback? And I always see things that you're doing that you're up to.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that at this point, people are just discovering it gradually at this point. I'm not really mass marketing it like I used to. Most of the people in the know about the book. They may tell other people, and then it spreads by word of mouth. So at this point, it's just like out there in the atmosphere for any who are serious Jimmy seekers to go out there and discover it. Just like we had to discover Curtis Knight and all these other people, they got to discover, I guess, Jimi Hendrix Black Legacy. So I appreciate you for what you do as far as the promotion of the book and the ideals, which is more important, the ideals of a Jimi Hendrix Black Legacy, doing what you do every year, just like you do Bootsy every year, just like you do these other things. You do Jimi Hendrix every year because you feel that he's that important and he's a part of our Black culture, and so that can never be taken away.
And the proof is in the pudding because you got the music now. Whether it's an old mix, cassette tape, remastered, so somebody gets money that may not deserve it, but whatever. The music is there. His legacy is there, and more, Corey, his legacy as a free man is getting a free Black man is getting some recognition because it is hard to understand that and it's hard to recognize that, but the benefits are lasting for generations when you get free Black men doing their thing.
I think they just had a recent clip they showed of a Jimi Hendrix interview, and when you listen to it, he's actually speaking against the military-industrial complex, talking against the missile defense systems that they had, which was very early back in the late '60s. But here it is, a Black guy speaking, on that, and I'm like, I don't know if people realize how dangerous that was back then. I mean, now it might not seem like a big deal, but for a Black man in that prominent position to be speaking against missile defense systems and making anti-war songs like Machine Gun and so forth, I mean, that was a very dangerous, precarious position he was putting himself in.
Yeah, he's presented as just as a freewheeling guy, as an easygoing guy, which is not a lie, but wait a minute, he was very courageous, and to be, self-made and take on, the the pop industry is one thing, but you're taking on like, all these aspects of civilization that just ain't ready for you. And so Jimmy has a depth of purpose and depth of soul and self that I think people get. And they get that, for example, when they if you're a fan of John Coltrane, you know that he is so meditative and spiritually focused in his own thing. You know that, and it comes out in his work. Some people are just devout, like Bob Marley. You just know he's devout, and then it comes out in their work. And Jimmy is devout in his freedom and his roots, and the flower of his freedom that he has. And I think once people tune in, you're just like, oh, wait a minute, I don't ever want to leave. And
Right.
I mean, that's universal and that's beautiful. People just need to know the whole story.
There's a version of Easy Rider that he did. It obviously is not the finished product, but in one of his versions, he's talking about searching for his Nubian queen. This is the kind of language that, people don't associate with Jimi Hendrix. If you dig deeper into one of his songs, I think Earth Blues, he's talking about a black woman being the first, of creation and things like that. I mean, he was hanging out with the Aleems. I mean, so, these he was hanging out with some heavy people in New York. That
Jimmy's
story
Lord.
doesn't get told. Yes. So all of this stuff, like you said, maybe somebody else will write a book. They can go deeper into that esoteric stuff.
Corey, you sent me an article about how legendary Jimmy's visit to Morocco was in Morocco, and people are
Right.
still talking about that. Maybe they're
Right.
making up stories, but it's still a story. And I'm
Right.
like, that is is, that could be its own book.
We got to remind people that North Africa is still Africa. So Jimi Hendrix went to
Yes.
Africa. So let's
Yes.
let's make sure we let people know that he didn't go to some, spacey place. He went to Africa, the motherland.
Exactly. Exactly. Can you talk about the power of, and you have been speaking on that, to have at that time the studio, to put the
Right.
studio together, to say that I'm going to do this, and it seems that when we start to make those moves again, people are the eyes are full attention is paid at that moment.
Right.
But
I
could you
mean,
give some context to that?
he was the first artist to actually design his own studio. He was spending a mint in the studios of other people, and they were like, why keep doing this? Why not build my own studio? So he was actually the first artist. A lot of people talk about the first artist to have their own private jet and stuff like that. But when you talk about the first artist to build their own, fund their own studio, you're talking about Jimi Hendrix. I mean, of course, Mike Jeffries came in as a partner with him and stuff like that, but he couldn't have done it without Jimi Hendrix. And Jimi Hendrix name and imprint is on that studio and it's still used today. Electric Ladyland Studios, Stevie Wonder and
Right.
all, even though some of the rap groups or whatever go in there. So I mean, that's a very powerful, yet another powerful statement from Jimi Hendrix to be his own independent, as you said, free thinker, and he doesn't get the credit for being a savvy businessman. But had he lived, just imagine the money he would be raking in from that studio.
Man, it just oof. See that sometimes you don't want to get too far in because then you're standing on that ledge. It's like, whoa, I don't want to start to think of where he could have gone, what he could have been.
Right.
Because
I mean, he was trying to get away from his management. He wanted to actually get black management, but we all know the story behind that. He didn't quite make it that far. So, he was going in that direction.
definitely was. He was going in direction musically and financially um, and on a number of different levels. And that just sort of speaks to how narrow our public perception is, particularly of some of these innovative black public figures. They
Right.
happen to be guitarists, just black public figures. There's a tendency to narrow down who and what they're about when they're actually, real complicated people, and we know that. And they have to be transcended on many fronts. And Jimmy was definitely that.